Welcome to 35 West. I'm Chris Hernandez-Roy, Deputy Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and co-host of the 35 West podcast.
With how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't
reform
think.
trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiation.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Chris Hernandez-Roy, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director with the Americas Program at CSIS, and the co-host of the 35 West podcast. Last year, U.S. trade with Mexico grew to nearly $800 billion, leaving Mexico to surpass both Canada and China as the United States' #1 trading partner. While U.S.-Mexico trade has long been a pillar of North American economic competitiveness, Washington's efforts to move trade away from China in favor of nearshoring and friendshoring in the Western Hemisphere, coupled with the advantages of a modernized trade agreement in the form of USMCA, has underpinned this increase in bilateral trade and investment. At the same time, Chinese investment in Mexico has skyrocketed, with estimates finding that in 2022, Chinese foreign direct investment in Mexico was more than double that of 2018. Furthermore, while Chinese investments elsewhere in the hemisphere focus on extractive industries like minerals and oil, in Mexico, manufacturing has received the lion's share. As the United States works to align incentives and deploy trade measures to de-risk from China, Mexico may represent a backdoor for PRC firms to circumvent these controls and gain access to the U.S. and Canadian markets. As elections in both Mexico and the United States fast approach, and the 2026 joint review of USMCA hangs in the background, we're honored to be joined today by Kenneth Smith Ramos, Chief Trade Negotiator for Mexico from 2017 to 2018 and one of the architects of USMCA. Together, we will discuss the direction and implications of growing Chinese investment in Mexico, as well as the broader state of play for USMCA, and how the agreement can continue to be an asset for North American economic security and competitiveness in an increasingly fraught geopolitical context. Thank you for joining us today, Ken.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, and to the CSIS for the invitation today.
It's a real pleasure to have you. As one of the authors of USMCA and the leader of the negotiations from the Mexican side, could you sketch a scene setter for our audience? How has the agreement evolved over the course of the past 4 years? And do you see increased geopolitical tensions as having raised the importance of North American trade integration?
Yes, thank you. Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the USMCA has been a very successful agreement. We've had it in place for almost 4 years now. And as you mentioned in the opening, there has been record numbers in terms of bilateral trade between Mexico and the U.S. Overall, the USMCA for all three countries is worth close to $2 trillion worth of trade. And also, foreign direct investment is increasing substantially in the region, especially in Mexico, where we also have record numbers in terms of $36 billion that we have received last year in foreign direct investment. So for the purposes that the agreement was negotiated for, it is working. Now, it is true that we face a much more difficult geopolitical environment that we had either in 2016 or in 2020, referring to the last two presidential elections in the United States. And the fact that North America has a long track record of a free trade agreement, a mechanism that guarantees this integration of our industrial clusters, of our agriculture, services, is something that helps to deal with these international shocks. When you're looking at situations in the Middle East or the Russia-Ukraine war, which for a long time created havoc in terms of impacts on the prices of agricultural commodities, energy commodities, the tensions in the China South Seas. So all of these elements create challenges for our region, but we are well positioned precisely to deal with these factors through the fact that we've had 25 years of free trade between our countries. I do believe there are important challenges. I know we're going to speak quite a bit about the situation of China as a U.S. rival on many fronts and what does that mean for North America. But I think after 4 years, we can say that the USMCA is working and it's an agreement that was modernized. In the view of Mexico and Canada during the trade negotiation of the USMCA, we came to the table with a position that we had to build upon a successful North American free trade agreement that for 25 years US had created a positive free trade environment in the Americas. At the time, that wasn't the position of the US government under the Trump administration, but at the end of the day, we wound up with a balanced trade agreement that I think benefits the three countries enormously.
We'll get into China, as you said, a little bit further along, especially as it could potentially present a challenge. But preserving North American economic integration will continue to be foundational for all three countries to navigate an increasingly fraught geopolitical context. Since the new agreement, USMCA, as you said, replacing the previous NAFTA agreement, since it came into force, what do you see as being the key challenges facing the agreement? What areas should the three countries focus on in order to build a more competitive North America?
Yes, there's a couple of areas there that were not addressed in the USMCA negotiations, which I think is important. On the one thing, I think labor mobility, the ability to have mobility of professionals, the so-called temporary entry chapter, it's something that was controversial during the negotiation because it touches the issues which are sensitive politically in the U.S. It's perceived as something that creates a more lax environment for immigration, which is actually not the case. I mean, what we're talking about in trade agreements is the possibility of professionals to move temporarily from one country to another, which, of course, if you look at the experience that the European Union has had over the years with labor mobility, it's certainly an element that enhances the efficiency of the economies of all the countries that participate in an agreement of this nature. So I believe that that's an area that we could work on, definitely strengthen, but the political reality is that right now the discussion between Mexico and the U.S. when it comes to the movement of people centers a lot on the issue of undocumented migration and the issue of the so-called immigration crisis at the border. So far, we haven't been able to make enough strides in that area. I believe that that's something that could definitely be enhanced and strengthened. And I think a very important area is the actual enforcement of USMCA commitments. And what I mean by that is we were able to strengthen and modernize the dispute settlement mechanisms in the USMCA. Under the NAFTA, it was very hard to form the panels, to come together in an agreement as to who the panelists should be and what the procedure should be for a dispute settlement panel to occur, to be formed, and to have a final decision. So what would wind up happening is that we would resolve most of our disputes under the NAFTA in the WTO because of this problem in terms of putting together the panel system. Under the USMCA, we fixed that. You have a system that is expeditious. You have a situation where panels are formed. They're issuing final rulings. The key question remains, as it always has, whether countries will have the political disposition, the will to go ahead and honor the decisions of panels when you lose a panel, or actually pursue a solution when you win a panel. And we've had a couple of examples in the life of the USMCA, the automotive panel that Mexico and Canada won against the United States on rules of origin. Well, Mexico, for political reasons, has not been pressuring the United States to comply with that panel ruling. And on the other hand, Mexico is clearly in violation of its energy commitments in the USMCA because of the changes to the electricity law. And the U.S. has only gone as far as asking for consultations. But it's been almost a year and a half where the U.S. could have asked for a panel. And we believe also for political reasons, not to disrupt Mexico's cooperation on immigration and security, they haven't requested the panel. So these issues at the end of the day are very important because the willingness of the countries to pursue the dispute settlement mechanism the way they were designed strengthens the long-term confidence in the agreement, the long-term legal certainty. So those are issues that I believe we should continue working on.
You mentioned labor mobility. I want to turn to manufacturing for a minute and ask you a question about that. We've seen increasing interest from U.S. investors in Mexico as a destination for strategic manufacturing and technology efforts, especially in the case of EVs and semiconductors. In your opinion, how prepared is Mexico to take on a greater role in these more advanced manufacturing sectors?
Well, as you know, Mexico has built over the years, thanks to the NAFTA, a world-class manufacturing platform with a young, skilled workforce. And we have become leaders in the production and export in many key sectors, such as automotive, which includes, automotive vehicles, but also auto parts and components, aerospace, machinery and equipment, electronic equipment, medical equipment as well. And this is due in large part to a lot of the investment coming in from the rest of North America into Mexico, primarily from the U.S. The U.S. continues to be our number one investor in Mexico. Almost 40% of the FDI coming into Mexico comes from the United States. But it's interesting that we've had more of a diversification. So since the USMCA came into effect, since it became clear that NAFTA was not going to collapse, as it seemed for a few months there in 2017, there's been growing confidence in the long-term certainty of investing in Mexico. And that has certainly helped Mexico move up the technology chain to engage in processes which are gradually less reliant on labor-intensive processes and more into high-tech. So I think in order for Mexico to make the leap, the necessary increase in technological capabilities to be able to receive investment and maintain it in sectors of the future, such as semiconductors, high-tech medical equipment, lithium batteries, Mexico has to continue working on presenting itself to the world as a country that's open for investment, that creates certainty in the long term, protection of IPR, for example, on patents and innovation, so that the investments continue to come in, not just from the US and Canada, but also from Europe and from Asia to strengthen some of these key sectors.
This year, both Mexico and the United States, Mexico, in fact, next month, will choose new presidents. What are some areas of common ground the two countries should focus on, which could help further trade cooperation regardless of who the victors are in both elections?
Sure. And this is somewhat related to your previous question, because Mexico can increase its capabilities to attract investment, to strengthen its technological know-how, precisely by working in cooperation with its North American partners. And that should be a priority for the next administration, certainly in Mexico. We still have, despite these record numbers of investment coming into Mexico, we have important structural impediments that prevent us from doubling the amount of foreign direct investment. We should be receiving over $60 billion instead of being at around $36 billion. We should be receiving at least as much FDI than Brazil is receiving. But we have important domestic challenges in terms of the access of energy, the electrical grid, basically the ability to produce and provide sufficient energy, especially electricity, natural gas, for all of these companies that are setting up shop in Mexico and for the Mexican population. But also we need to have investment in transmission and distribution of electricity throughout the country. And this will certainly require cooperative work with the US, with Canada, facilitating the entry of companies in the energy sector that are allowed by our changes in our constitution in 2013 to participate actively in power generation, in oil and gas exploration, in operating marine terminals. So many of the things where we have seen backtracking by the Mexican government in this administration, closing those spaces for private investment in the energy sector, that's something that I believe the next administration, regardless of who wins, even if there's a continuation of the Morena party in power in Mexico, there's going to have to be a return to cooperation between private sectors of all three countries in the energy sector in Mexico. And I think those are some of the key areas where the Mexican government should emphasize the efforts to develop Mexico, as well as infrastructure. I mean, we have, as they say, 21st century trade. These numbers are nearing $1 trillion between Mexico and the US, but we have, to a certain degree, 19th century border crossings. We need to upgrade the technology. We need to build new border crossings and strengthen our ability on railways and on maritime ports if we are going to be able to take advantage fully, not just of the USMCA, but of the nearshoring phenomenon, because companies are investing in Mexico for the domestic market, but also as a springboard to enter the United States, to enter Canada, or to be able to enter the 50 countries with whom we have 14 free trade agreements. So infrastructure development is very important in the future for Mexico.
Infrastructure, and you mentioned energy, North American energy integration. Is that a subject for future USMCA discussions?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, it was during the USMCA. We had been working prior to the victory of the elections in 2018 by Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Mexico, Canada, and the US had put together a very robust chapter on energy integration and cooperation. As you may recall, once the president was elected, López Obrador, his team on trade came into the negotiations and worked on some key elements alongside the outgoing administration to try to close the agreement. And that chapter on energy integration was sort of put aside for Mexico. And we were left with a very short chapter which essentially talks about Mexican sovereignty and hydrocarbon resources belong to the Mexican nation, which is a fact by our constitution, which, by the way, that doesn't mean that we don't have energy commitments, which has been the source of the dispute on energy with the United States. But essentially, that chapter on integration, what it included interesting elements which are now captured in a side letter between the U.S. and Canada within the USMCA, which talks about exchange of information between regulators, utilizing international standards when it comes to regulating the energy sector, focusing on interconnection of grids, for example, on electricity or pipelines, on natural gas, etc. I think in the future, we should return to that. I know it's a sensitive issue politically for the current administration in Mexico, but I repeat, even if Morena repeats in the government next time around, of course, if the opposition wins, it'll be easier, but we need to have a vision of opening up the energy sector further so that there can be private investment, because that is the biggest challenge that we have in Mexico. You have huge indebted state monopolies such as Pemex with a debt of over $100 billion. It is untenable to continue for the government to subsidize with taxpayer money something that is really by itself not going to yield the necessary results to develop the energy sector. So I do believe that is one of the biggest priorities, and we should, perhaps not in the review of 2026, we will be talking about what that means, but certainly moving towards a more cooperative environment and openness of the energy sector in Mexico.
Excellent. We teased our listeners a minute ago or a few minutes ago that we would start talking about China. The pandemic helped accelerate a reorientation of supply chains from the global to the regional, with renewed emphasis being placed on concepts like nearshoring and friendshoring to suggest the United States double down on trade within its shared neighborhood. However, it seems that while the U.S. has been hard at work erecting what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has described as a, quote, small yard, big fence, unquote, aimed at keeping Chinese investment and influence out of strategic sectors, Mexico may represent a backdoor for the PRC to maintain influence. Ken, in your opinion, how significant is the recent boom in Chinese investment in Mexico?
Well, it's interesting because definitely the issue of China is without a doubt the big elephant in the North American room, so to speak. Mexico receives a lot of foreign direct investment, as we have mentioned, primarily between 35 and 40% from the U.S. We have some countries in the European Union which have been traditionally very strong investors in Mexico. The former member of the European Union, the UK, but also Germany, France, Spain. From Asia, we have large investors. Japan is number one from Asia, investing in Mexico. South Korea, number two. But increasingly, over the last 5 years, we have seen a growth in Chinese investment, as you mentioned. In fact, since 2015, this has multiplied 5 times in terms of the investment from China coming into Mexico, China and Hong Kong. But it's interesting because traditionally, and even now, compared to what China invests in the rest of the world, they have invested very little in Mexico. The official statistics show that last year, we were talking about less than $1 billion, around $650 million in Mexico. However, these are the official figures. And in reality, what we see is we see many Chinese joint ventures, for example, in the automotive sector with MG, the UK company, that is registered in the Mexican investment statistics as a UK investment, when in reality it's Chinese. And that happens in other sectors as well. So what we have seen, if you look specifically at the last 2 to 3 years, a very strong interest by Chinese companies to enter in the auto parts sector, and an interest or stated interest towards the future to enter in OEMs, basically in automotive plant manufacturing. The interesting thing is that that's not already happening. I mean, you're not seeing right now Chinese OEMs producing vehicles to export in the United States. I think that has been more an issue of political concern in the United States, but it's not a present-day reality. That doesn't mean it may not happen. I do believe there is a legitimate concern on the part of North America as to how, as a top producer of automobiles in the world, how are we going to deal with this overcapacity in vehicles coming out of China, especially when the Chinese economy is slowing down. So people are consuming less of these goods in China, and therefore China is looking to export, not just vehicles, but key inputs such as steel, aluminum, machinery, and equipment. So it is legitimate to be concerned as to how we are going to be competing with the region. And I do believe that it's already a political issue in the U.S. to what degree Chinese investments in Mexico would be looking to evade specific restrictions that the U.S. has imposed on China. Now, what I can tell you is that Mexico is a country that's open to foreign direct investment from all countries in the world, and this brings benefits to Mexico. And if a company, whether it's from Denmark, China, or Brazil, invests in Mexico, complies with domestic regulations, complies with the rules of origin of the USMCA, and exports into the United States, right now, for all legal purposes, it is a Mexican company exporting into the United States. So any restrictions based on the origin of the capital of that company would be imposed by the U.S., would be a violation of the USMCA. So we need to have a conversation within North America as to how to address, in a coordinated way, these concerns on the impact that Chinese investment can have on the region. But talking about just, for example, a candidate Trump has said, simply shutting down any imports into the United States that come from Mexico where Chinese companies have invested in particular sectors, especially in the automotive sector, right now, that would be illegal under the USMCA. There are many policy options available instead of opening the USMCA and trying, for example, to change the way rules of origin are designed. Because as you know, rules of origin are designed based on the production process of particular products, not the origin of the capital. And I think if we were to change, to open up the USMCA, which would open up a big Pandora's box, but if in 2026, at the request of the US, we were to open the USMCA, try to tinker with the rules of origin in order to discriminate specifically against China, that would be a dangerous precedent internationally, because we would be changing a paradigm that we've been using for decades, if not for half a century, on how to establish rules of origin in trade agreements at the WTO and, of course, in the North American region. And if we begin discriminating not products, but countries, it's a slippery slope, because the European Union or China or the rest of Asia could start doing the same against North America. In other words, just simply stating that because a product comes from North America, it is a threat to national security, and therefore I have a right to impose barriers. So I don't think we should go in that direction. There's many other policy options that we can analyze, one of which I've been mentioning before is that we can have stronger trade monitoring systems to know if products are coming in from China, from any other region of the world into Mexico on fair trading practices, if there's dumping or countervailing duties. So you could tighten the trade remedy measures, have stronger IPR enforcement, for example, tighter labor and human rights enforcement as well. I think some of the measures that the U.S. has imposed against China and other countries in the world where there's violations to human rights, and therefore, if that's demonstrated, you can restrict the imports. All of those things make sense, and there could be coordination between the three North American countries in that direction. But saying that in order to stop China, quote unquote, you need to reopen the USMCA and change the rules of origin, I think that's a risky proposition.
Yeah, that sounds definitely like a Pandora's box. Beyond the U.S. concern of Chinese investment in Mexico, is there, even given the fact that, as you've said a few minutes ago, the level of investment still is not huge, of course, taking into account the fact that some of these companies, maybe the ownership isn't fully transparent, but is there a risk to Mexico itself beyond the U.S. concern of too much Chinese investment?
Well, I wouldn't say that in general. You could say that there's a risk of too much Chinese investment. What we need to do is analyze what other countries are doing. What are the best practices? What are other main trading partners of Mexico doing? We know, of course, what the United States is doing, and I mentioned some of those measures against China. We know some of the measures that the European Union is considering or imposing. I think Mexico should analyze how to make sure that the imports coming into our country and the investment coming into our country does not represent any potential threat either to other companies in terms of IPR violations or issues of national security. We know that, for example, in the United States, there are important concerns, and some politicians have mentioned it. This has been discussed in the Congress, federally, at the local and state level by governors of the border states, as to how some of the equipment or the technology and the investments decisions that China is making in the northern Mexican border could represent a threat in terms of the surveillance equipment, information technologies that could transfer information back to the Chinese government, etc. I'm not saying Mexico should necessarily act on that right now, but I do know that there is not the same degree of urgency in the Mexican government right now with those issues. And perhaps the Mexican government should take a look at what those concerns are on the part of the U.S. and on Canada, what they have done in terms of their legal and regulatory framework to address those issues, and consider whether Mexico should look at that as well. For example, Mexico has no restrictions on investments on strategic sectors other than, for example, the energy sector, specifically on nuclear energy, obviously military equipment, manufacturing of weapons, things that are along the more traditional pathway of something that should be reserved to the state, right, to the Mexican state. But there are other areas in semiconductors, information technologies, AI, for example. That's something that we could also begin to address in terms of a trilateral discussion within the USMCA. But those are issues that I think the Mexican government should analyze to see if we need to sort of tighten the rules as to where investment can and cannot come in from other countries in Mexico.
One thinks of USMCA, there's a lot of thought put into the relationship between, on the one hand, Mexico and the United States, and on the other hand, the relationship between the United States and Canada. Very little, and there's almost no discussion of the relationship between Canada and Mexico. And obviously the trading relationship between those two countries is much smaller than it is with the United States. But is there room for more Canada-Mexico trade and investment and cooperation?
Absolutely. And I think it's very unfortunate that exactly what you mentioned, which is oftentimes we forget that we have a vibrant trade relationship, an economic relationship, a cultural relationship with Canada. I mean, if you look at the number of Canadian citizens that have moved to Mexico, especially to the warm areas, it's amazing. The tourism that comes from Canada into Mexico, and just the trade relationship itself, it's above $45 billion in trade, which people will say, well, that pales in comparison to the trade that we have with the United States. Yeah, but Canada, has 10 times less population than the United States. But in certain provinces and in certain areas of Canada, you have a purchasing power that it's above the average GDP per capita in the United States. So you have a situation where, in addition to that, there is a production patterns in the US and Canada that are similar when it comes, for example, agricultural products. Canada buys a lot of fresh produce from Mexico because Mexico can produce it during the entire year. Canada cannot. But Canada produces grains, it produces meat products, oil seeds. Canola is a big export from Canada into Mexico. So there's a great degree of compatibility, for example, in the agricultural, agro-industrial sector. And then it has strengths such as the U.S. has in automotive, in aerospace, in areas where there's a lot of compatibility with Mexico. So what I think we're seeing, and I've been a big advocate for this over the years, is that we've only seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of the relationship that could develop between Mexico and Canada. When I go to these trade fairs or conferences in Mexico, I emphasize we should not just put all our eggs in the U.S. basket, that we should really look at the potential for growing trade with Canada. And I think it's been a very successful relationship. And I think it can grow quite a bit. And I think in the USMCA, it was demonstrated in the negotiations. It was demonstrated that Canada and Mexico share a lot of the values that have made NAFTA work over the years, right? And what we were trying to do there, as I mentioned at the beginning, is build upon, back then, 25 years of successful free trade. And I think we share a lot of the objectives that during the USMCA negotiations, the U.S. did not share, which was how can we enhance our trade relationship to include very important social elements on the labor side, labor protection, environmental conservation. That's something that we don't speak enough about. But Mexico and Canada and the USMCA negotiations pursued actively, for example, having more forceful actions on climate change effects mitigation. And I think that's an area that we can develop in the future in the USMCA. And I think Mexico and Canada can play a very important role.
Most trade agreements do not have a review process for the simple reason that trade agreements really are there to provide a predictable, stable trading regime between countries. So what was the point of including a review process in USMCA?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Chris, and I get that question often. What happened is that the United States came to the table with a proposal which was along the lines of what President Trump had been pursuing in general for the agreement, which is saying the U.S. has gotten a raw deal. We need to have more control over what happens with this agreement in the future. And the proposal specifically that led to the review process was a very, what I would say, a very toxic proposal from the United States government, which essentially established that after 5 years of the agreement being in effect, in other words, the new agreement, the USMCA, unless the three heads of state of Mexico, Canada, and the United States agreed to continue the agreement would automatically end for all three participants. And of course, immediately when this was tabled, there was a revolution, so to speak, by the private sectors in Mexico, Canada, and the United States saying that this would create terrible uncertainty. Imagine investing millions of dollars to be able to comply with the new rules of origin in the automotive sector, not knowing if in 5 years you wouldn't even have a trade agreement. So we were able, along with Canada, to work to dilute that, to take that off the table. And at the end of the day, what we wound up is with a mechanism which can be very positive, which is actually something we didn't have in the NAFTA, which is having this periodic review. And the language is wide enough or vague enough, if you want to look at it from that perspective, on purpose. It says that there will be a review every 6 years, that the ministers in charge of trade can bring recommendations as to how the agreement can be improved in terms of its implementation. You must remember that there's a lot of decisions that they get taken regarding the USMCA that do not have to go to the legislatures, that do not require reopening the agreement, administrative decisions on the procedures of how the panels work, decisions having to do with how the working groups on sanitary, phytosanitary measures or investment, etc., work, and doesn't necessarily mean it's a renegotiation. But that language was the result of that original position where the U.S. said, after 5 years, the agreement is done unless I agree that it continues. And I think it can be a positive element because one of the problems of the NAFTA is that people feel that we negotiated the NAFTA and then we locked it up and threw away the key. And now, one of the complaints over the years was that civil society was not able to inform the process or try to make modifications to the agreement. And the reality is that when we came to the negotiation in 2017, there were many provisions in the NAFTA that were severely outdated. You know, there were concepts that are essential in today's free trade environment and today's economy that didn't exist 30 years ago, such as digital trade, for example, or good regulatory practices, etc. So I think it's a positive development. Nevertheless, because of the political environment, it can be a risky proposition going into 2026 because if one head of state or a couple of them raise their hand and say, hey, I want to reopen the agreement, we have to make sure that we don't have backtracking, right? That we don't shut down access that we've already gained through the NAFTA or through the USMCA.
Yeah, exactly. I think the review can kind of cut both ways. It could be a way of genuinely improving certain aspects of the relationship, but it could also open a Pandora's box, particularly if any one of the three parties digs in their heels on points of contention. For instance, as we discussed earlier, enforcement of the dispute settlement panels, which in some cases there hasn't been an enforcement of them. They could insist on that as a point of leverage. So given your experience in handling the negotiations in 2017, 2018, what advice would you give the trade negotiators from the three countries as they're getting ready to do the review process?
I think it'll be very important for all three countries right now. I mean, we're running late, at least in Mexico, to set up a mechanism in each one of the countries as to how to consult with society in terms of obtaining input as to key issues that are either pending or that should be considered for the USMCA. Some of the issues pending, for example, I already mentioned labor mobility. We also were not able to advance fully on gender provisions that Mexico and Canada pursued. But then there's new elements there on artificial intelligence, more on climate change, which was excluded from the agreement. All of this should continue to be discussed. But my overall recommendation would be, let's not reopen the agreement. Let's not have a renegotiation. A lot of these issues that I mentioned can be operated on parallel tracks of cooperation or of administrative decisions that enhance the ability to cooperate in these different chapters without reopening the agreement. If we reopen the agreement, it'll be very easy because of the political pressures, because of the difficult geopolitical environment, a tendency to favor economic nationalism or protectionism, whether it's in agriculture, on steel, on services, on digital trade. So my recommendation would be, let's not reopen the agreement. Let's utilize the 2026 review as an opportunity to reiterate North America's commitment to free trade and work on a cooperation track parallel to the hard rules of the USMCA on enhancing, facilitating trade and erasing borders for all intents and purposes when it comes to trade, to industrial clusters being integrated in all three countries, and relaunching the agreement, as is the rule in the USMCA, for another 16 years. It's an odd mechanism, but essentially you review it every 6 years. If all the three countries agree to continue, it's relaunched for another 16 years, and then you repeat that exercise every 6 years. But let's not reopen it. It's not going to lead to any good outcomes if we start playing politics around the USMCA in 2026.
Ken, is there anything we didn't cover? Anything you'd like to add to our discussion? Maybe a question that I didn't think of?
Well, no, I think that what we are seeing, and going back to the first comment that I made, I do believe that one of the priorities right now, or the elements that can be used to sell the idea of a more integrated North America, is precisely the fact that we face difficult times geopolitically, right? We're in a difficult situation, perhaps not seen over the last 40 or 50 years in the world. And I think those countries that are able to strengthen cooperation, to strengthen free trade with their neighbors, with their top trading partners, will be in a better position to increase security in their region. And by security, I mean, of course, physical and military security, but also food security. We saw during the pandemic the growth of agricultural trade between Mexico and the U.S. at an annual rate of 20 to 25%. So this is essential in a moment of crisis. So it's physical security, military security, food security, and of course, economic security in the long term. So those should be issues that we should keep in our minds when we're talking about whether we should strengthen economic integration in North America.
Ken, thanks for joining us on 35 West. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's been an honor.
And that's it for this week's edition of 35 West. We hope you enjoyed listening and that you'll stay tuned for future episodes.